You're Slytherin, right?
No, I'm Ravenclaw. Rather interesting that you immediately assumed I was Slytherin.
Don't you have like a Slytherin sweatshirt?
No, I have a Ravenclaw sweatshirt.
I don't know why I thought of you as a Slytherin.
I've described myself as a Ravenclaw with a Slytherin rising, but I'm predominantly a Ravenclaw.
I'm Team Voldemort. I can't wait to see which parts of this you've kept in. Hello, and welcome to Expected Own Goals. This intro has not come easily to me. This is my 6th take edition. I am your host, Eric Morgan.
I'm Evan Davis. This episode is going to be anchored by a wonderful conversation we had with the resident NWSL reporter over at Spotrac about the impending offseason, Taylor Vincent. We will be getting into lots of fun details about the process and how it's evolved over the years, and what we can expect this winter with the new CBA hanging over our heads. But first, we've got a couple of friendlies to talk about that the U.S. women's national team played in Europe. 0-0 to England just after Thanksgiving, and 2-1 against the Netherlands on Tuesday of this week. A game that maybe they didn't deserve to win, but maybe if you peel under the hood, maybe they did. I don't know. Emma Hayes rolled out some interesting lineups in the absence of Triple Espresso, Sophia Smith, Mallory Swanson, and Trinity Rodman, and got very, very stodgy in front of almost 80,000 fans at Wembley Stadium in London, and played rather chaotically for about 45 minutes before going back to first principles and shutting up shop in The Hague. So, Eric, what are your first impressions of these games?
I would say, out of the two games, a win and a draw seems fair. The game that they won, they probably should have drawn or not won. And the game that they drew, they probably should have won. My feeling was Emma Hayes, by the time we rolled around to the Netherlands Tuesday friendly, was just looking to see what it would take in terms of lineup, interpretive lineup management to lose a game with this U.S. women's team. And she nearly found out.
She basically said in the post-match presser, I kind of maybe wanted to see what would happen if we got ourselves into a position like that. So she, at least ex post facto, spun it as, yeah, this is sort of what I wanted. I wanted to see how the team responds to falling apart.
To what it might be like to have this much talent and be a manager only, say, of Jill Ellis's capabilities.
Yeah.
And I feel like she was like, what if I tied both hands behind my back? And she was like, we still have feet, and this is a game played with feet. It turns out pretty good. Mm-hmm. My feeling was the England game was basically a snooze fest. I don't know how much there is to learn from that game. I know that people were coming down hard on Emma Sears. I thought Emma Sears actually had a fine game. I loved Casey Kruger for her absolutely brutal takedown of Chloe Kelly. The immediate hockey retribution of that moment spoke to the darkness inside my apparently Team Voldemort soul. I thought it was not much of a game because those are the things I'm pulling away from it. Evan, what did you think?
I mean, both sides were missing a lot of their first choice attacking options. You know, Lauren James wasn't there. Lauren Hemp wasn't there. Chloe Kelly seems to have fallen out of favor with Serena Wiegmans. She hasn't gotten a lot of playing time, so Jessica Naz came in as the other winger on the other side of Bethany Mead. Ella Toone wasn't there, so England wasn't exactly throwing their best weapons out there either. And then, of course, with the primary forward line of the U.S. not being around, it fell to players like Sears and Thompson to try and get something done. And so both teams who are very interested in trying to control space and build out are going to probably just nullify each other and cancel each other out. And that's sort of what happened. I mean, England didn't really have much control of the game, but they didn't allow for all that many great chances from the U.S. either.
Yeah, the Thompson chance early on, the game is completely different if she finishes that. And instead, it sort of felt like, as the game dragged on, this might be the best clear attacking opportunity with design and intention that we're going to get all game. And I think, lo and behold, it kind of was.
The U.S. ended up putting up a below average amount of XG on the day, 1.1, and came out to about average on XG per shot. So it was like not a shameful or disreputable performance, but it didn't have a lot of spark to it. But you know what? Emma Sears got more minutes in her legs in a U.S. shirt. Alyssa Thompson proceeds on her comeback tour apace, and Yasmin Ryan really is demonstrating why I had Mandela affected the idea that she had been capped before last month. Yeah, it was a bit of a shoulder shrug. And not to disrespect defenders, far from it, but Casey Kruger was my player of the match, even beyond the foul on Chloe Kelly. She was excellent. But usually when a defender is your player of the match, that means it wasn't the most scintillating of games.
You call it a foul, I call it renegade justice.
People really homed in on that, and because I'm the dweeb that I am, was like, actually, the thing that demonstrates how great Kruger was the way that she defended Georgia Stanway in the corner 1v1 like 5 minutes before that, where she basically cut off every possible angle for a cutback or a take-on, and also avoided putting her foot on the ball until she could get Stanway back toward the touchline rather than the end line so she couldn't force a corner kick. That's just brilliant stuff. And not easy to do when you're up against one of the best midfielders on the ball in the world.
Yeah, I felt like for a 1v2 matchup among the FIFA ranked teams, and you can laugh at FIFA rankings all you like, and maybe this game shows you why, I felt like a depleted England really lacks depth. Like the drop-off from their top lineup is a lot more severe than it is for the U.S. bringing kind of a B team.
That might be true.
The U.S. B team really is still pretty good, or the A- team as it may have been on that day.
In England's defense, not only did they not have their first choice number 10 available, but they also didn't have their second choice number 10 available. So they really were sort of digging pretty deep on their depth chart at some of those positions.
I think that the one place we might have a split, and maybe this is where we transition over to our next game, the Tuesday game, which I actually think has a lot more to learn from. I feel like the Yasmin Ryan I was watching, I know that we're going to have disagreement about this. I actually wonder, A, if her athleticism plays at this level, and B, just for the position she's being deployed in. And I thought she was, bar the pretty brilliant assist to Lynn Williams, pretty bang average. And maybe not the player I would love to see getting key minutes in these kinds of games. That said, the assist she creates in game 2 for Lynn Williams is exactly why you put up with a certain amount of futility from wingers, or like bang averageness from attacking players, because all you're really looking for are those moments for them to create. I don't know. Give me the argument in favor of Yasmin Ryan as like long term.
I actually don't think these two ideas need to be in conflict. We're not expecting Yasmin Ryan necessarily to develop into a first choice right winger for this team. We're expecting her to get reps to see if she can be a good backup in 2027, which means there's 2.5 years of development runway where she, Alyssa Thompson, Ali Sentnor, Emma Sears, like a bunch of different potential wingers can continue to develop. I think that she is worthy of being in the pool. If you're not bringing Trinity Rodman and Mallory Swanson along with you, I think she's a very worthy option to start in games like this, but she's not going to be better than Trinity Rodman or Mallory Swanson if they're available. So bang average with 2.5 years to go until the World Cup means she can get better and solidify a spot in the 23, not in the 11. Or maybe she doesn't, and it's fine. Like, I thought these performances were respectable and indicate that she is worthy of inclusion in future rosters. I don't think that she's going to be a starter in a competitive scenario in the next 3 years. But that's also not what the objective of playing her in Europe this weekend was.
In your mind, what do you think were sort of the key objectives in these games?
Well, I mean, Hayes laid it out pretty explicitly, and even if she hadn't, you would think that these would be the objectives, which is learn some things about what you have against the best. Because asterisk next to FIFA rankings, it's still a matter of fact that England and the Netherlands are 2 of the 10 best teams in the world. So even though they're friendlies, this is an opportunity to see how young players or inexperienced players in the U.S. setup handle themselves in those situations. She even said explicitly in the pressers, like, you have to experiment, and sometimes those experiments fail. But that's not a bad thing. And certainly the experiments of the first half against the Netherlands were failures. But so what? Like, these players need to learn how to handle themselves in these kinds of environments. So that, I think, is the ultimate hope, that you're getting these players minutes in these kinds of situations, and then also you're gathering data on what you as a coaching staff need to do to help develop them, to make them better, and tell them how to make themselves better. Through that lens, I think that these games are successes, because again, who gives a shit about the results?
Let's move and break down the Netherlands game, which I thought had a lot more to talk about.
Yeah.
This is generously the most experimental lineup that Emma Hayes has thrown out, to her own credit.
Interestingly, though, there are a lot of pieces that you would think would be in a first choice 11 in a competitive match anyway, with Emily Fox, Naomi Girma, Tierna Davidson, Sam Coffey, Lindsay Horan, Rose Lavelle, all in the 11. So there is a core of like sort of what we expect an Emma Hayes U.S. team to look like. The experimentation comes in like how they're deployed, who else gets added. You know, Jaden Shaw was put in the 9. And again, Hayes said, like, I wanted to see how Jaden handled herself as a pressing number 9. You know, Yasmin Ryan getting a start against a really strong side, trying to create width with Rose Lavelle out on the left rather than playing as the 10, and then leaving Lindsay Horan to sort of be this free player to float around and find space. Corbin Albert pushed up a little bit more, Sam Coffey in a single pivot, and then try and use your pressure to prevent the Netherlands from building out. Where it didn't work was that they got their pressing triggers wrong. And so they got exposed and they got stretched really, really easily. And if there's one thing that maybe I take away long term that may not be fixable, at least in the immediate term, is that Jenna Neiswanger might not be the answer at left back. Because Romy Luchter put her in her pocket for 45 straight minutes.
Yeah, it was not Jenna Neiswanger's best game. I think I would add Corbin Albert to the mix here too. And with Jenna Neiswanger, it was the way in which she was targeted. And with Corbin Albert, it was the way in which she was deeply ineffective and basically absent from either defensive effectiveness or ball progression. She is the marking body on the first Netherlands goal. She blows a marking assignment and then really struggled, got herself caught offside, sort of felt like she was jamming in with Lindsay Horan in places. I don't know. I jokingly said this to you and then on the Discord that I just don't think players playing in France should be on the national team anymore because they aren't playing high enough levels of competition.
Yeah.
But with Corbin Albert, I know that the stat that's sort of been circulating is that she has the lowest on-ball value of any midfielder in D1 Arkema, passing value, and plays on PSG, making that stat all the more shocking. And there was a space in the field that was actually kind of both on Albert's side a fair amount and on Neiswanger's side that the Dutch just like homed in on and found a cushy little, you know, warm space and exploited to hell. Jenna Neiswanger seems like actually the harder solve here. I mean, like, what is the solve? Is it Alyssa Melanson? Is it going to a back 3?
Right. Yeah. I mean, Casey Kruger is probably not going to be around for the World Cup in 2027.
That's what I'm getting.
And Alyssa Melanson has a lot of potential, but she just hasn't been played very much. She's only got 1 cap, I think. So she needs to probably get a lot more reps and probably get those reps soon to feel like you got a plan in place. But yeah, I mean, it seems like Crystal Dunn might be, excuse the pun, done. And therefore, what do you have to fall back on if Neiswanger is not the answer? It's a good question. I think Melanson is worthy of chucking out there, especially since the next couple of years are going to be almost entirely friendlies. Wanted to throw this interesting little stat out. It's Y-Scout, so is the quality of the data the highest? Maybe not, but it's got some utility. It's got some value. And also, they're the only ones who report advanced data for friendlies like these. And maybe it's not fair to compare Corbin Albert to Sam Coffey in this instance, but Sam Coffey is the standard. Like, if you want to play as a deep-lying midfielder for the U.S. women's national team, you kind of have to play like Sam Coffey. Sam Coffey, by Y-Scout's measure, lost possession of the ball 8 times per 96 minutes in competitive games with the U.S. in 2024 against top teams. So that's Mexico, Colombia, Canada, Brazil, Germany, and Australia across the Gold Cup and the Olympics. 8.1 times she lost possession of the ball per 96 minutes. Corbin Albert, almost 12 times per 96 minutes. in that same mixture of games. And possession lost in the defensive half per 96 minutes. Coffee, 2.5 times per 96. Albert, 5.5 times per 96. This is actually where I think Albert's weaknesses are really manifest, is that she does not keep the ball well at all. Focusing on games against really top opponents, like, there are arguments to be made that she's at least handling herself well in terms of the passing game, getting balls where they're supposed to be, but she cannot hang on to the ball to save her life. And when you lose the ball in your own half, that's when things can get really exposed, and that's exactly what the Netherlands wanted to do. They wanted to win the ball through aggressive pressure and not allow the U.S. to get settled, and that worked often in the first half.
The thing that boggles my mind the most with the wastefulness that we see sometimes from Corbin Albert is it runs exactly counter to what Emma Hayes is attempting to do, which is maintain control and possession. And it also exposes the U.S. to quick counters that can get them buried deep and force them into uncomfortable positions. So it's a thing we've been flagging for months, in addition to like Corbin Albert, shitty teammate, Instagram, social media poster. Corbin Albert with the ball liability strikes me as if it is an emerging and continuing to emerge Emma Hayes blind spot. I felt like the minute Hal Hirschfeld came on, we got to see how much Hal Hirschfeld has grown in the last year, and B, the game just felt more settled.
Yeah, I mean, I think it started before Hirschfeld came on. The second half, Albert dropped deeper, and they played more as a double pivot. As much as you should feel comfortable with Sam Coffey playing as a single pivot when you want to stay front foot and you want to stay aggressive, when you're getting run over, you have to make adjustments and realize that a double pivot will give you more solidity and will also prevent Sam Coffey from constantly being keyed in on. Because interestingly, this is another thing that I discovered, again, Y-Scout data, but Coffey's numbers between playing against top 4 sides in the NWSL in 2024 versus top sides in competitive tournaments with the US are sharply different. Like, she does not play as well with the U.S. in possession. And I think it's because opposition knows that once you cut off the supply from her, there's not going to be much available to progress the ball in the midfield from the U.S. It's that Albert isn't like elite, even though she's probably passable. It's that Horan is given this free role that doesn't require her to step up in a more structured defensive approach or be more disciplined in trying to get the ball forward either. You cut off Coffey, you bully Coffey off the ball, you intercept her passes, and boom, game over. It wasn't very balanced, and once Albert became that double pivot, which then Hirschfeld took over that role in like the 66th minute, that felt calmer, more controlled, something that Hayes wants.
I mean, I think I'm also starting to get to the point with Lindsey Horan where I'm wondering like what the point of Lindsey Horan is.
Yeah, kind of.
Inside this system. I think that was less true when she was doing swashbuckling heroics on a broken Vlatko team, and more so as a system and control emerges. Free Lindsey Horan feels like either redundant Rose Lavelle without the defensive work rate or an extra striker, not striker.
Playing in a 2 with Shaw a lot, especially in the first half, which was so odd to me.
Which also did Shaw no favors.
Yeah, sure.
There were these huge gaps that when the U.S. would attempt to establish any sort of forward progressive pass, there was just sort of no. I mean, the Dutch were pressing well, but also there were no bodies coming to the ball for the U.S. To receive.
Yeah.
And that leaves you in a pretty dangerous position. That said, you know, the soccer gods giveth and the soccer gods taketh their away. Sorry, Berman. No one found that out harder than you in the first half of this game. A fluke and a half of an own goal, and then steady as she goes, super sub, Lynn Williams are the dividing line. We talk about sort of the flukiness of finishing, but really good chance creation is what decided this game. And it is that the U.S. created one really good chance after being given a gifted goal by the Dutch. And that is where I think a lot of club time spent together with Lynn Williams and Yaz Ryan
that helps.
Paid off.
Big time. And Williams talked about it in the press conference afterward, that like they already have that chemistry, that communication to know that all you got to do is get inside the 6-yard area and Ryan's going to put it on a dime for you. Let's talk about Lily Johannes for a second.
I didn't want to put too much pressure on her.
A lot of hay made about to what extent Johannes can contribute now. Is she the answer to get us away from Albert? I want to throw this out. Johannes, who only played 23 minutes, normal time minutes, had 20 touches. She touched the ball almost once per minute. Albert touched the ball once every about 3 minutes. To show you just how much more active Johannes was able to get in possession with the U.S. midfield. And she wins the aerial duel that falls to Yaz Ryan's feet that allows for the goal to happen.
I mean, I think Lily Johannes seeks out the ball in a way that we don't necessarily have a lot of. I think we can credit Ajax with some of that. Obviously, I'm being facetious when I say if you play in the French league, you shouldn't be playing for the U.S. women's national team, and then include a Dutch league player. But I think that Lily Johannes' ball hunting in possession is an invaluable tool that she'll bring to this team. I don't want to put too much pressure. I felt like what she did once she had the ball was sometimes out of kilter and off rhythm. I can't imagine the intensity of being booed for not selecting my national team and then making my first, now that I'm a member of this team, international appearance on the soil of the country I rejected. That's a lot to carry with you. But I also feel like Lily Johannes is now one of many very good options that the U.S. have to look at to replace the very mediocre Corbin Albert going into January camp. What was once a position of concern is no longer a position of concern.
This was an education for both the players and for Emma Hayes and her staff, these 2 games. I think that was all they were hoping for. And that they managed to get what would have been 4 points from 2 games, I think is just cherry on top of it.
Against teams that they can expect to face in the knockout phase of tournament.
Hayes said in her press conference explicitly, I and the players are going to learn way more from these 2 games than we ever would in a couple of friendlies on home soil in the middle of a sunny afternoon. And she's right. Even if they play like shit, she is right.
These games are kind of much ado about nothing, but there is value there for the players themselves. And also, Emma Hayes still has yet to find out what it will take to lose with this U.S. women's team.
True.
So I can't wait to see the experimental 3-6-1 she rolls out next time. Before we switch on to other business and then get to Taylor Vincent, let's pour one out for Alyssa Naeher.
Sure.
Alyssa Naeher, who is not retired from the club game, will be back with the Chicago Red Stars. Do you have a favorite Alyssa Naeher experience memory from her time with the U.S. women's national team? For me, it's the PKT she took against Sweden.
Sure, that's great. Her saving Steph Houghton's penalty in the World Cup semifinal in 2019.
Thank you. I was leaving that for you. Alyssa Naeher, tough as nails, an entire vibe. I saw she got shouted out by the Olympics official Instagram yesterday.
Yeah, that's wild.
I think that's all it takes. When the Olympics reaches out to say, hey, you were good, you've really accomplished something.
Hayes said in the post-match presser that Naeher was the greatest goalkeeper the U.S. women's national team had ever fielded. Oddly enough, there aren't actually that many to choose from. Basically, it's Brianna Scurry, Hope Solo, and Naeher. That's kind of it. Whatever you want to say about the cups of coffee that people like Jill Lloyd and Nicole Barnhart and others got, like, it really is just those 3. So, was she better than Solo? It's interesting to think about. Very different eras. You know, Nair's probably facing much, much better attackers than Solo ever did.
Yeah.
But was Solo just so far and above the competition of the time that it wouldn't matter? Like, she'd still be great now. It's a question that's impossible to answer, but very interesting that Hayes said that.
All right, let's finish up with 2 little transfer news and notes.
Not little.
Yeah, no, 2 substantial in what is not necessarily a star-laden free agent period, as we will discuss with Taylor. Madison Curry to Seattle from Angel City. Angel City, what are you doing? Great move, Seattle, is sort of my feeling. And
then Delaney Sheehan signed a 2-year plus an option deal with the Houston Dash. If there is anybody out there who still thinks that quote-unquote small market teams can't be competitive players in this new free agent landscape in which we live, I present you the Seattle Reign signing Madison Curry and Delaney Sheehan signing with Houston.
It's nice to see Seattle sign someone young.
Yeah.
And by young, I mean under 30. for Sheehan that might be more of a head scratcher for people. I love this move, actually. I bet she got paid.
The chatter is that she got a substantial pay bump. We expected that she was probably going to get paid. That was probably the thing that allowed for Houston to get her, because for whatever the reason would she ever want to go there. I mean, they've got a great stadium and they've got great facilities, but they have no GM, they have no head coach, and they are generally pretty chaotic and bad. So great stadium plus great facilities. You also need great salary in order to say yes to something like that. And so what it also demonstrates is that a team like Houston now knows what they have to do if they want to be competitive on the free agent market. You got to pay players. And the fact that they did it, I think, is the really encouraging sign that the system is all of a sudden not going to only favor the big teams, so to say.
I think the other thing that I would say here is these are both really savvy moves from teams that have not demonstrated savviness of late. Particularly with Houston, who knew? Maybe you don't need a GM, Houston. If you're going to go make banger signings like Delaney Sheehan without a GM, who needs a GM?
I think the other part that people need to remember when they clutch their pearls about the lack of a draft and the early start to free agency for a lot of players was Madison Curry guaranteed to be a starting fullback next year with Giselle Thompson and M.A. Vignola in the depth chart? As good as Madison Curry was, that's not a guaranteed starting spot if both of those players are healthy from wire to wire. Guess what? Seattle is pretty bereft of fullbacks at the moment, especially with Sofia Huerta on loan. So I'm pretty sure Curry is getting starting 11 minutes from first whistle next March. And that is a really appealing selling point that other teams like Seattle or Houston can use to draw eligible free agents to their rosters. And I'm fairly certain that that's what Seattle did here.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now we have our conversation with the one, the only, Taylor Vincent of
Spotrac, tomato.
Anyway, enjoy.
What a treat today to be able to speak with, as all of you, I hope, have come to understand, really is the resident NWSL expert in all of our hearts, as she is known over at Spotrac, keeping track of every transaction, all the contract details that are available in the public space. This resource is more important than ever, given the state of free agency, the vagaries of the new CBA that is now officially in place. We need a resident NWSL expert to guide us all through it. So we are beyond delighted to open our off-season discourse with none other from Spotrac, Taylor Vincent. Hi, Taylor.
Howdy.
You and I have known each other for a little second, but I've known your work for a lot longer. Can you walk us through your personal history with getting interested in transactions, roster rules, roster construction, all those goodies in the NWSL? When did that all start for you?
It started as my off-season project. I think it was last season. It was the second go at free agency, and I was just like, how do you know what happens? And so for about 2 weeks, I just went through and I started like, okay, this is the roster. Okay, these are like basically Googling the heck out of everyone's names. And then I still had like a really big list of names, because I will say that happens a lot with the expansion teams is they will acquire a player's rights and they often forget to announce that they've signed them or for how long that they've signed them. Just say we got them, right? And I'll give you, right, Alex Morgan was one of the ones, right? It was really big. They announced that they've got her playing rights, and there was nothing in the announcement about the length of contract. So then I went and, right, this was across the league, bugged the heck out of all the comms people, kept pestering them until I had answers on every single team. And so it started off with, I had a giant Excel sheet. I just kind of would keep that up to date. Excel, as we know, is such a great way of doing data management. And I just like, right, and whenever there was an update, I'd always be like, okay, this is the date that it last got updated, and just kind of kept it in. Every team had their own tab, and from there, it just kind of grew. As far as the rules go, I'm an engineer in my day job, and I really love to understand how things work. I really love reading the like 80-page roster rules. I will tell you, I have the poor person at the NWSL PA who runs the media section. I bugged him again. Was it 2 weeks ago? I was like, hey, the new CBA, is that still TBD? It's been a few months. Yes, it's still TBD. I'm assuming that there's still some stuff that they're kind of trying to kind of finalize there in terms of why it's still TBD. As a fan and as someone who covers the league, it can be really hard when you don't know the rules and how they're changing, and you're expected to cover this offseason when we don't have a draft. So are there special rules about signing rookies? There's so much stuff. We're in the middle of a trade window, and we know that there's stuff in the new CBA about trades. Does it start acting now? Because there's stuff in the new CBA, like the bonuses for end of season awards, which don't increase this year. So I just have to wait.
If you could have one of those things, one of those pieces of information drop into your lap like overnight, which one of those questions would you like answered like tomorrow?
There's no expansion drafts. We don't have a college draft. And those two events are large drivers of trades in the offseason. So I think that considering that, we're not going to see as many trades this offseason as I think we have in the past. Think about draft day last year. There was 3 trades draft day before the event even started. At least.
Big ones too.
Yeah, there was so much chaos. And without a driving event forcing that, I don't think a lot is going to happen in terms of trade. So it's probably not that one.
Do you think a lot of the offseason movement is going to be back-ended toward the end of the window as teams sort of figure out what the new rule landscape is?
The FA stuff was very vague in terms of, right, they're like, oh, new free agents can sign. And I was like, is someone really going to sign with another team? But then hidden in a recent release from a team was, oh, yes, new free agents can sign starting December 10th, which is when the end of season things. And I was like, oh, that was not anywhere else. But it was like a little sub-note in someone's release about a player resigning. We have a very interesting trend going on because of how early free agency started up, right? The first run at free agency, I think it was about 50% people stayed with the same team, right? There was only like 45 free agents. Last go at it, you introduced restricted free agents, right? You lowered the bar a little bit for free agency. There were something like 75 of them. And you only had like 33% stay with the same team. That's a dramatic change. And right, so far we've had 28 players re-sign with the same team, which is more than the same team signings in 22 to 23 and 23 to 24. So I think it'll be really interesting because we kind of have seen some of those re-signings that we would expect already happen, and then there are ones that haven't happened. Marta's still a free agent. Do I think she's leaving Orlando? I don't think so. But, right, it's still free agency. Like, you never know.
I sometimes forget that a lot of our listeners are actually relatively recent fans. You and I, Taylor, are not recent fans. This league was very different in the way that it approached roster construction in the past, in the pre-CBA era, you might call it. Can you give our listeners an overview on how transactions were designed or what mechanisms shaped the contours of transactions in the earlier years of the league? Fill people in on what discovery rights are.
Oh, that's where you want to go?
Its implications are maybe not well understood by the public, and I think they're sometimes not well understood by people who follow the league closely. They were something that really was a primary cause for why certain players ended up at certain teams and why they might not have ended up at other teams. With this new CBA, discovery rights are gone. No longer are players held by discovery rights.
So I think you really want to go back to before the first CBA, which was U.S. national team allocated player and Canadian national team allocated players, which basically said that U.S. soccer is paying someone's salary, not the NWSL team themselves. Someone's probably written the document saying of how that basically impacted the U.S. women's national team's success, right? The fact that U.S. soccer could pull them whenever they wanted and have extra camps and stay for extra long. So I think that was a big part of the first CBA, was removing that because basically there was no end of the contracts, right? If you were a national team allocated player, right, that team owned your rights to play there in perpetuity. Considering it's some of the best players that the U.S. has to offer, it's kind of not great. Yes, you have good job security and you're probably getting paid than some of your teammates more, but you have zero say in where you're going or where you're playing. The first CBA was driving it, removing that, starting to introduce the idea of free agency in there. Discovery is best described as invisible dibs, but every team is limited and you're in an order. If it's your turn, you can call dibs, and we'll use the Jaden Shaw example because I think that's the most recent one. And right, she's a important player in the U.S. women's national team and for San Diego. Jaden Shaw had sued the league or threatened to sue the league. I don't remember if she actually ended up filing to be able to play as someone who is under the age of 18 and not in college. So, right, you can't enter the draft. And so there was no mechanism like there currently is for young players to enter the league and play professional soccer. So she entered into Discovery. And before she entered into Discovery, she had been practicing with the Washington Spirit. She had been training with them, working out with them, probably under the expectation she was going to sign with them. However, the San Diego Wave was higher in Discovery. And so they were able to say, dibs, mine. Basically, Washington, San Diego had some talks about what it would cost for them to trade the rights of Shaw, and they couldn't come to an agreement, and Jaden Shaw now plays for the San Diego Wave. It happens like this, but it wasn't just the youth players, right? It's most of the international players. So Discovery rights until the newest CBA still existed, and you had teams. I think someone still has Abby Wambachs. I think Seattle still had Abby Wambachs the last time that they published who had whom, right? It's a limited list. You don't get like 80 dibs on people. There's a limited number of spots. Basically, teams could hold on to these even if an international player wanted to come. If someone else had them on their list for Discovery from a previous year, then the team who wanted to bring in an international player would then have to basically trade for the right to sign a player, which creates a barrier that I don't think anyone really wants in order to come play in the NWSL when a team's like, oh, yes, we'd really love you. And you're like, I'd really love to play with you. But so-and-so has your rights. And on top of paying you the amount I want to pay you and the transfer fees that I want to pay you to your current team, I also have to pay them money. Discovery is very, very fun because there is zero transparency on it. We don't know what the order is. We don't know who's at the top of the list at any time. Some of the names we know, right, they've leaked somehow, but we don't actually have like an official list of this is every team's list and this is where the order stands at any moment in time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but also players who were drafted who would then go play overseas, not necessarily members of the U.S. national team playing pool, but players who might get drafted, elect not to sign, and then go play in another country's league. The rights for that player in the NWSL are held on to by the team that drafted them.
For a year. And then they go back through the system and someone can call dibs.
This all to say that Discovery rights became like a pretty significant trade chip for many years in how players were able to move. And certain players could obviously generate leverage to try and force a trade relative to their standing in the ecosystem. Eric asked, what's the one thing that you wish that you could know about roster rules? But what is it about this current CBA, in as much as we know what we know about it, that you feel is the most significant change for how rosters are going to be built going forward?
I mean, I think it has to be the opening up of free agency to everyone, right? I mean, you could make an argument that it's the NWSL draft because collegiate drafts are inherently American. But I think giving everyone the right to free agency is it's going to be different because for how long, the first 2 years, you can easily just say, nope, you're stuck with me. I'm going to sign you. If you want to re-sign with me and you want to stay in the U.S. and play here, you need to sign this X length contract that'll put you through for a number of years. So I think that and having the players be able to move is a big thing.
As you mentioned, Abby Wambach, her rights being still possessed by Seattle at the last looking, I was reminded that Seattle does love a veteran player. And that, of course, if you'd asked me a team that had Abby Wambach's rights into her 40s, it would be Seattle. My question for you is, now that we sort of have entered, I guess what I would view as like the Wild West period of free agency, where it seems like everything is open, what kind of player do you think this advantages the most? And what kind of player do you think this hurts the most?
At least in the short term.
There is no transparency to the public on the player salaries unless it's released, right? There's specific CBA rules around it. The new CBA, I have gotten confirmation, will not have transparency on salaries for the general public. But the players only got transparency a few years ago. I think that the reduction on the limitations on free agency, that helps a lot of the players get to pay equity. Lola Bonta was on the Offseason docuseries saying that she wasn't one of the top paid players on her team. It gives you that. It gives you a little bit more leverage. Now, the thing that it might hurt is the younger players. If you look at the draft from 2024, most of the round 3, round 4s don't end up getting contracts. And if they do, they don't get a lot of playing time. I think there's a couple exceptions there this past year. But to a large extent, them being drafted to a team gives them a chance to be then invited to that team's preseason in a case when they might not otherwise be. Teams don't invite 20 NRIs, So for college players without a draft, yes, the bidding and they will get higher and they'll be able to decide where they go. But that will only apply to 15 to 25 players. It'll be a lot harder for college players who aren't in that upper echelon to find spots, especially considering how many teams are already at high number of active players signed for 2025. There's a lot of teams that have a lot of people signed for next year.
It strikes me as if that's always going to be the squeeze until some sort of form of academy begins to exist and you start having larger apparatus inside the team, like second team leagues, the way you have in now MLS and in Europe. Until you start having that, there's a scary gulch that exists between being like a talented young player who might not have yet distinguished themselves at sort of in those college-staged years. It just feels like there are big gaps. And do you think secondary leagues are going to pick up those gaps or like fill those holes?
Maybe like a Madison Curry, who obviously had a breakout this year, potentially could have been a Rookie of the Year candidate. A player like that, drafted in the 4th round, invited to camp, manages to win a contract, and then becomes an everyday player. What happens to a player like her that would potentially have been in the 2025 draft now? Is the USL a place where they can increase their contract value?
I mean, I think the USL is trying to become, right, it's a tier 1 league, but right, as we saw, there was a bunch of loanings of people who weren't getting minutes out. I think 14, maybe 15. I can't remember off the top of my head. So I think potentially what I would love to see, that is just my own musings, is I want like an NFL combine. Right, I know that some teams have done like goalie camps and they've collected, and I think North Carolina and Louisville might have done one with Orlando last year. But if we're going to remove the draft, it's a televised event that someone was under contract for. Let's throw a combine in there.
As a person who loves data and who also loves like the raw competition of combines, yeah, of course it would be fantastic for like the hyper nerds to be able to log in and watch, to just like be able to watch like people run shuttles or raw sprinting and have somebody who you hadn't considered or maybe wasn't from a major program or maybe was a high school player just distinguish themselves in that way.
In these off seasons that you've covered the NWSL, have you sensed trends in how teams generally have changed their approaches to signings and trades and building their rosters? Is there a style of GM that seems to want to constantly be getting younger, or is there a style of GM that's really going for high dollar free agents? Has that sort of emerged since the 2022 CBA was signed that maybe wasn't there in the Wild West days?
Well, I mean, I think we have so much GM turnover that it's hard to really say a trend.
It's true.
Right? I think, right, you can easily, Gotham had 1 draft pick, and by the end of the year, she was at North Carolina. Portland loves goalkeepers.
Wait. Does Portland love goalkeepers or do they just acquire
Either
them?
or. I don't know at this point. Like, it's up to the GM. There's teams that are in smaller markets. I had an interview with Ryan Dell earlier this year where we talked about that Louisville wasn't going to win in a bidding war for free agency. So, right, that's kind of where they were looking at like less known markets for their international players and kind of trying to focus on stuff like that and lock down key people. Free agency players will get paid more, right? They're going to go where they get paid more, understandably. But also teams want to pay as little as they can, and players want to get as much as they can, which puts them at very different odds with each other.
Yeah, what teams do you think benefit most from this brave new world, and what teams do you think are in the greatest peril now that we're dealing with this new landscape?
The small market teams are always going to kind of struggle a bit. It's just the reality of the situation, because when there's a lot of options, like you have to be able to throw a ton of money, right? Location wise, do I want to be in LA or do I want to be in the Midwest, not near a beach? Now, granted, I'm a Californian, so I hate traffic. The answer might be slightly different for me. The Europeans coming abroad, or right, people from other countries who might not know, like, it's a hard question to answer because I think it does come down to each team and what they're willing to do, right? I think that San Diego has new ownership and a lot going on there. LA's got new ownership. Fingers crossed for some midfielders. Year 3 running asking for those. I think you could pick every team needs something. I think you can go through the run. I'm going to choose the West Coast teams because that's kind of my space. But
since you're mentioning San Diego, there have been rumors circulating recently that Naomi Girma might be moving on. And we don't know anything beyond the fact that there are rumors, but maybe we can use that as a jumping off point for talking about how the international market really changed the dynamics of roster construction last year and how it may yet change the dynamics of roster construction in the upcoming offseason. Because as we know, with the guarantee of no trade clauses, the universal guarantee of contracts, no longer are there semi-guaranteed contracts in the league, and various other parts of the CBA, theoretically is going to make the NWSL a more attractive market for international talent. And how does that affect the available American talent when there are potentially more internationals coming here? And also, how might the availability of the international market affect trying to keep players like Girma, for example, in the U.S.?
For background, up until March of this year, each team had 5 international spots. These are tradable. You can trade them for up to 3 years in the future, but every team had 5. That means you have 5 players who need a visa, it's a P1 visa, in order to play soccer in the U.S., right? So players who get green cards, they do not need to take up an international spot anymore. A lot of players go that path that they're not counting up against it if you're questioning how Orlando has so many Brazilians.
But that jumped up to 7 players.
Yes, we're up to 7 players, but we didn't have an off-season with that. The week before the season starts, the teams have to submit their final rosters, which are compliant under the 26-player limit. We're going to get to see an off-season where people can go ham, right? Angel City is only using 1. Utah is using 6 because Chloe Lacoste's poor ACL does not count as number 7. But a large number of the teams, they're still at 5-ish. I think that's kind of the mean number. There's a large number of teams who are under 5. So I think that expanding those spots is going to mean that there's likely going to be more international players coming to the NWSL this offseason.
And how does that affect a market like Girma? If Girma is all of a sudden rattling the cage saying, I want to maybe ply my trade overseas, and it's just going to be a much more competitive market to try and keep her now that free agency is guaranteed, that is legitimately added pressure now to try and re-sign a marquee talent. Does that mean that prices are just going to keep going up and up and up, just also try and keep the best talent in the NWSL?
I think so, honestly. And I think for those who don't know, allocation money is monopoly money. Teams can stockpile that. So basically, allocation money is you can purchase extra cash because they didn't really have a hard salary cap limit. And teams were able to do this for years. There's no tracking of allocation money. So whether a team bought all of their allocation money or not, you never knew. Racing Louisville confused everyone when they traded away the right to buy some of their allocation money this past year. Everyone was really confused about that for a hot second. All allocation money needs to be used in the next 3 years, right? We're moving to a hard salary cap line and transfer fees. So there's basically a rule about your net in, net out, and you have to be under, I think it's $500,000 or you start taking hits towards your salary cap. Girma's going to be a giant out. I wouldn't be surprised if she leaves, if that's a record transfer fee. Because if I'm San Diego, Alex Morgan retired, that was your marquee face. And then to have Girma, I'm not taking small amounts of money for that transfer fee. But right, it gives them the ability to now they have to spend it. I mean, I'm not going to say no to spending money. This was just Black Friday.
You're right to bring that up because all of a sudden that money has to be used. You can't not use it unless you just want it to go away. That does create a different kind of dynamic.
Evan and I are at odds on this one. Do you think Caroline is a Courage player come the start of next season?
The end of season roster decisions will tell us a lot more because they have 27 active players signed. And if you want to sign one more, part of that is people are still on contracts that are semi-guaranteed. They become guaranteed for 2025 at the roster decision date. And I love the roster decision date in the competition calendar because it has a timeline for when they need to announce things. And for people who don't know, the league does not often have deadlines for when things need to get announced, even signings. Teams can sit on signings for months and months and then announce when they feel like it. It has to be 24 hours before the player takes the pitch against someone. The fact that there is a deadline in them for them to publish it publicly, love it.
You can tell our listeners, when is that?
Team announcement deadline is 6 p.m. Eastern time, so 3 p.m. for those of us on the West Coast. Tuesday, December 10th.
From this recording, you've got 8 more days to sort all of that out. Why is it so difficult for an orderly stream of communication to emerge from both leagues and teams regarding the announcement of transactions? Why is it so difficult?
It's really not.
Why do you think they make it difficult?
I think the new CBA didn't help this year because they needed to announce the new CBA, and the new CBA had new deadlines, and the new deadlines were months pulled in. And so I don't think that helped because they announced it twice. They didn't even need to announce it twice. You could have just said free agency are going to be announced at the end of the week, option including the people whose options have been declined or not declined. Should have just done it once. Instead, they announced a list that included players whose options had been taken or denied. So the first list told us stuff. And I'm looking through the list and I'm like, is this the second year in a row Alana Cook's extension has been spoiled by this freaking free agency list? And it had. And I'm just dying inside. I'm like, y'all are messy. It's not that hard. You give teams, hey, this is your deadline to announce. This list is coming out at X time. It says stuff about your team if people are missing or they aren't on there. Whether or not they want it, that's what happens. And then you leave it to people like me to try to just basically be like, I'm not trying to spoil stuff for you, but I need to keep my database up to date.
With respect to the CBA kind of gumming up the works in 2024, this isn't a new issue.
No.
It has presented itself basically at every iteration of the league. It's fascinating to me that it allows for teams to, as you have mentioned, sit on signings or sit on roster moves for weeks, sometimes months before the public becomes made aware of them. And because they don't seem to have their ducks in a row, as you mentioned, we'll get a piece of information that should have come before another piece of information that we don't know, which we then have to infer what that means. And it just looks sloppy. As someone who has followed the league for a long time and has covered it formally for a couple of years now, why do they make it so hard on themselves when it clearly doesn't have to be?
I really can't answer that. It brings me so much.
It's a classic, like, what's the incentive to make it better for them? I think the answer is there isn't one yet, so they just don't.
Fan engagement in the offseason will help drive in-season engagement as well as revenues for teams because it makes people interested in the sport, potentially could sell more tickets, could potentially get more eyeballs on games, on television and streaming, and end up becoming better for the ecosystem as a whole. In my mind, I would think that would be the incentive, to try and create a genuine hot stove environment in the winter months.
Well, just like Bia had an option. The option was exercised. That should have been a big old social media flourish. But instead, it just kind of slides under the table because I got it confirmed. I updated our database, getting it confirmed from a team spokesperson, and then someone else got it also confirmed. But it's just like missed opportunities to get the fans excited and to get the fans engaged.
I have always felt like there is something inherently airing of dirty laundry feeling about those kinds of announcements that teams see as, generally speaking, a net negative, even when they are obviously net positives, just because there sets an expectation on.
That the other teams in the league, there's like a transaction. Like they can see when things happen.
Totally.
Right. So it's not like you're keeping stuff a secret. Everyone is learning what happened. It's just not the public.
No, exactly. And I think a lot of leagues, and maybe this is where the NFL led the way of just like making things a little bit messy and airing their dirty laundry in the media. Suddenly, what was happening in the offseason was also of great value to the audience and built anticipation. And I think it happened in this really uncontrolled way. And often teams are control freaks when it comes to the dispersal of information.
A little bit.
Nobody who works in public relations is cool with just like seeing what happens in the media landscape. That kind of thinking, there's a protectionist streak that exists in relation to like what gets said publicly or what gets shared publicly that this league has never gotten beyond.
Yeah, to flip it around to the player side, you talked about how the lack of transparency around salaries remains the de jure policy of the NWSL Players Association, and it's embedded in the CBA. MLS has had salary transparency for a few seasons now. Do you think that the NWSL Players Association should move toward MLS's model in making salaries transparent?
I mean, as a fan, I think it's good. If you're following a team and you're like, oh, like, can we trade for this person? Does this fit under our salary cap? There's a couple of different options if you want to play fantasy with the NWSL, but the numbers are all just magic. They're hand wavy. But right, if you could actually get a realistic one and be like, oh, well, we need this. Like, what can we do? Oh, we have this much money left in our cap, and it looks like we have X amount of allocation money that we could use if we wanted to get a transfer fee. It helps the fan engagement. But that's just a selfish point of view for me. What I'm assuming the PA is concerned about is that some of those salaries probably don't look as the fans think they should, and then getting flack about that. We'll go like Lola Bonta saying on the offseason that she made the NWSL best 11 and was in the top 11 players on her team. Because the players now have that transparency, right? That is a very new thing for them. And they can now use it when they're bartering, but the fans don't get to see that.
I just wonder, do you feel as though the fans would have a negative reaction in the sense that they would think NWSL players are underpaid and be upset about that, or that they were overpaid? I think
you're probably going to have both.
That? I just wonder if players just couldn't use that to their advantage and use some furor stirred up by fans who thought that they were severely underpaid as leverage, potentially as a bargaining chip. I guess because I don't see salaries going down in MLS since they have made their salary information transparent.
The CBA has minimum salaries increasing year over year. So
right.
It's not like people are going to be losing money, right? You may have people who, right, I want to stay in market for whatever reasons, and I'm willing to take less money than another team might offer me simply because this place is home. And at the end of the day, teams are likely going to pay as little as they can so that they can maximize their cap. That's the same across all sports.
I've noticed that besides Caroline and Midge Purse and Marta, there aren't a lot of really high-profile free agents this go-around compared to last year, which felt like a feeding frenzy.
Well, I think it was learning from last season. I think that a lot of teams realize it becomes a bidding war, especially for the big names.
Yeah.
And, right, you want to try to avoid that. Right, I think compared to because one of the things that I keep, it's not on Spotrac because I don't even know how to do it, is I keep track of people who are going to be free agents throughout the season and get signing extensions. So I think last season there was, 9 of them. This season, I think there's 14 or something. So right, you kind of see teams being a little bit more active in their re-signings so that they avoid getting into the bidding wars.
And does that ultimately disadvantage players, do you think? Does that end up depressing salaries overall?
I don't know anyone's salary, so I can't...
What does your gut tell you?
Even like Sophia Smith, she would have been a free agent. Portland doesn't want that to happen. And so in her signing, yes, it was only a 1-year extension, and then for the first time ever, you got a player option. Some of the players, it gives them more power, right? Because they're like, well, why shouldn't I just wait till the end of the year? You have to make an offer that is worthy of me not doing free agency. But I don't think that that's all the players. I think that's the top 5% players who are going to have that leverage in order to really keep lifting the bar, right? Because Sophia Smith's contract, outside of the fact that it was the first player option, was still up there in terms of record breaking.
With the understanding that, like, beyond that top 5% having the leverage to keep their prices high if they're going to sign an extension, if you look at that list of players who signed extensions this year, is there somebody who jumps out to you that maybe you think could have really created a really competitive market for themselves and potentially driven their price up had they decided to not re-sign mid-season and go to free agency in the fall?
Okay, so there was, I was wrong, there's 16 of them. I feel like Denise O'Sullivan. The thing is, this is where you don't know, right? You don't know what North Carolina offered her, but you know that there was rumors about her trying to, not maybe her trying to get out, but other teams trying to get her in the middle of the season break towards like the WSL. And I think there was rumors about trying to get her there, but without knowing the numbers, right? That's kind of where, if you don't have transparency, all I can do is guess.
I will be very intrigued to see, once the dust settles on this offseason, if the union and player agents start telling more players to hold off on signing an extension. I just wonder if that is going to be a trend, because I can't imagine how it doesn't depress player salaries outside of that upper echelon at the end of the day.
Well, I mean, it could also be security, right? A lot of those extensions are long.
No doubt.
I think if you look at it, 40% of them, so 6 of them were 3 years. Another 3 were more than 3 years long. There was no 1-year contracts. 3 of them were 1+1s. Phoebe McLernan signed a 3-year extension. Might she have gotten more money in free agency? Yeah. But she has a 3-year, I don't know if it's fully guaranteed at the end because transparency again. But this is where I selfishly want the transparency.
It's nothing new across sports and leagues and genders, right? A lot of players are willing to trade away more money for guaranteed security. And this league, I imagine that incentive is even stronger, knowing the history of instability that a lot of players are dealing with.
What do you teams? Teams never fall or switch locations.
Yeah. Owners are never vindictive or petty or create toxic working environments.
This is news dump time. So if there was something like deeply unpopular to be done, it would happen now, but I didn't expect anything.
Yeah. You can follow Taylor on Blue Sky at TayVincent6, the number 6, and read all of her work at Spotrac.com/NWSL. Taylor Vincent, you're the best.
Thank you.
That was great. I love Taylor Vincent.
She's the best, man.
One of the most essential follows, full stop.
Yeah, once again, Spotrac.com/NWSL to not only read the articles that she writes about transactions, but also just peruse the updated in real-time databases of the status of every team's roster at any moment. It's great stuff. In the meantime, be sure to do everything that we always want you to do. Rate us, review us, follow us. Tell all your friends about us. Rate us 5 stars if you're going to rate us at all. Drop a review in your podcatcher of choice if you have the option. Join our Patreon for only $6 a month, which gets you 4 bonus episodes every single month, plus access to our Discord server and access to our live in-game live streams, which is a lot of fun. We're running a holiday special. We are offering gift memberships for a year at a 30% discount, which you can find the offer code and the link in our show notes on how to access that. Get the Woso fan in your life a 1-year membership to the XOG Patreon, or if you want to buy yourself one, go grab it. 30% off on a year's membership for the holidays.
Yeah, who says it's gauche to get yourself something you really like for the holidays?
I completely agree. Follow us on all social channels at XOwnGoals. That's the letter X Own Goals. And if you believe we've made an own goal, email us at expectedowngoals@gmail.com. That's the letter expectedowngoals@gmail.com.
Bye.